The sun blazed like vengeance over La Junta, Colorado, as Cassidy Reynolds pushed through the doors of Thatcher's General Store, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her like a shadow. Blood trickled down her palm where she'd clutched her medicine pouch too tightly, the leather cords cutting into flesh already calloused from years of work no proper lady should know. It was 1878, and the town of La Junta had long memories too long for Cassidy's liking. At 22, she'd already lived several lifetimes of scorn. Born to a respected rancher's daughter and a Cheyenne healer who'd passed when she was just 14, Cassidy had inherited her father's knowledge of plants and healing along with her mother's stubborn determination. The combination had proven dangerous in a town that feared what it didn't understand. "We don't serve your kind here," Mr. Thatcher said loudly as Cassidy approached the counter, his voice carrying through the store. "Bad enough when your father was alive, filling your head with heathen nonsense. Now you're out there practicing it yourself." Cassidy felt the familiar burn in her throat but swallowed it down. "I need flour and sugar, Mr. Thatcher. I have money to pay." "Money won't wash away what you are," he said, eyes narrowing. "Your mother should have known better than to bring that savage into our town. Look what it got her buried before her time with a half-breed daughter no decent man will touch." The store had fallen silent, every eye fixed on Cassidy. She stood perfectly still, remembering her father's words, "The river does not fight the rock, it simply finds another path." "Very well," she said quietly, turning toward the door. "I'll take my business elsewhere." "There's no elsewhere," Thatcher called after her. "Town meeting voted last night. No business in La Junta is to serve you. It's time you moved on, girl." Cassidy froze, her hand on the doorframe. "You can't do that," she whispered, though she knew they could, they had. "It's done," Thatcher said, satisfaction thick in his voice. "You have until the end of the week to be gone. Otherwise, the sheriff will escort you out personally." The bright Colorado sunshine felt like a mockery as Cassidy stepped onto the boardwalk, cast out. Banished from the only home she'd ever known because she dared use her father's remedies to help Mrs. Wilkins when the town doctor had given up on her fever. Because the treatment had worked, and that frightened them more than if it had failed. She walked with mechanical steps toward her small cabin at the edge of town, her mind racing. Where would she go? How would she survive? Her entire world was contained within the boundaries of this dusty little town. 2 blocks from the general store, the whiskey-soaked laughter spilling from the Silver Dollar Saloon made her quicken her pace. Nothing good ever came from that place, especially not for a woman alone. As she hurried past, the batwing doors burst open and 3 cowboys stumbled out, their raucous voices setting her nerves on edge. "Well, look here," one of them called, his voice slurring, "if it ain't the witch girl herself." Cassidy kept walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "Hey." The man's hand shot out, grasping her arm. "I'm talking to you, half-breed." "Let go of me," Cassidy said, her voice low and steady despite the fear climbing up her spine. "Or what?" he sneered. "You'll put a spell on me." His companions laughed, emboldened by whiskey and cruelty. "I believe the lady asked you to let go." A deep voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Cassidy turned to see a tall figure standing a few feet away. The sun at his back threw his face into shadow, but she could make out broad shoulders and the unmistakable silhouette of a cowboy hat. "Mind your business, Quinn," the drunk cowboy spat, but his hand fell away from Cassidy's arm nonetheless. The tall stranger stepped forward, and Cassidy got her first clear look at him. He had eyes the color of a storm cloud and a jawline that could have been carved from granite. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, not a cowboy then, but the new deputy she'd heard rumors about. "Harassing a lady is my business," Deputy Quinn said, his voice deceptively soft. "Now go sober up before I decide the jail cells need occupants." The men muttered curses but retreated back into the saloon, leaving Cassidy alone with her unexpected defender. "Thank you," she said, already turning to leave. "Wait," he called. "Are you all right, Miss Reynolds?" "Cassidy Reynolds," she paused, studying him. "And I'm fine." "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." He frowned at that, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of tarnished gold. "I'm Deputy Thomas Quinn, New to town. He glanced toward the saloon. Is this a regular occurrence, being accosted, or having strangers step in? A bitter smile curved her lips. The first, yes. The second is a novelty. His frown deepened. That's not right. Very little is, Deputy. She adjusted her shawl around her shoulders. If you'll excuse me, I have packing to do. Packing? Yes, it seems La Junta has officially decided I'm no longer welcome here. The words burned like acid. Thank you again for your intervention, but it won't matter soon enough. Thomas Quinn studied her with those storm-gray eyes. Why are they forcing you out? Cassidy laughed, the sound hollow even to her own ears. I'm different. My father was Cheyenne. He taught me the old ways of healing. Last week, I saved Martha Wilkins when Doc Sanders couldn't. They're calling it witchcraft now. She expected to see the familiar revulsion, the fear that always followed such admissions. Instead, something else flickered in the deputy's eyes, something that looked remarkably like respect. So you're a healer, he said simply. I know plants, herbs, what they can do. She lifted her chin. I'm not ashamed of it. You shouldn't be. He replaced his hat, still watching her. Where will you go? The question caught her off guard. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. I don't know. Somewhere people care more about whether you can help than where you come from, I suppose. He nodded, as if her answer satisfied him somehow. Can I walk you home, Miss Reynolds? That's not necessary, I insist. His tone left no room for argument. Those men might circle back, and I'd feel better knowing you got home safely. Cassidy hesitated, then nodded curtly. They walked in silence through the dusty streets, the stares of townsfolk following their progress. When they reached her small cabin nestled against the backdrop of cottonwood trees, she turned to thank him again. When are you supposed to leave? He asked before she could speak. End of the week. The reality of it settled over her like a shroud. 5 days. Thomas Quinn nodded thoughtfully. I'm sorry about that, Miss Reynolds. Are you? She challenged, suddenly tired of pleasantries. You wear that badge. You're part of the system forcing me out. The badge means I uphold the law, he corrected. Not that I agree with every decision this town makes. He took a step back. Good day, Miss Reynolds. Cassidy watched him walk away, a tall silhouette against the setting sun. Only after he disappeared from sight did she enter her cabin, the weight of her future pressing down upon her like the sky itself. The following morning, Cassidy woke before dawn, as was her custom. If these were to be her last days in La Junta, she would spend them gathering what herbs she could from her favorite spots along the Arkansas River. The thought of leaving the land she knew so intimately was almost as painful as leaving the cabin her parents had built. She dressed quickly in her practical skirt and blouse, tucking her father's hunting knife into her Buddha habit that had scandalized the townsfolk, but had saved her more than once from coyotes and snakes. With her basket over her arm, she slipped out into the gray light of pre-dawn. The morning air held the promise of summer heat, but for now it was cool against her skin as she made her way to the riverbank. The familiar path brought some comfort, and Cassidy found herself relaxing for the first time since yesterday's confrontation. Here, among the whispering grasses and secretive birds, she could almost forget the hatred waiting for her in town. She was kneeling beside a patch of yarrow when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Rising quickly, she placed her hand on the knife in her boot, ready to defend herself if necessary. But it wasn't the drunken cowboys from town who appeared around the bend. It was Deputy Thomas Quinn, mounted on a handsome chestnut gelding. He reined in when he saw her, tipping his hat. Miss Reynolds, you're out early. As are you, Deputy. She straightened, basket clutched before her like a shield. Following me, a small smile touched his lips. Not intentionally, I ride the boundaries each morning before my shift, helps me know the land. He dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of years in the saddle, finding what you need. Cassidy glanced down at her half-filled basket. What I can. Some herbs don't transplant well, so I'm gathering seeds to take with me. Thomas nodded, running a hand along his horse's neck. My mother was a gardener, had the greenest thumb in Missouri. Used to say plants were better company than most people. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. A shadow passed over his face. Lost her 3 years back, influenza. I'm sorry, Cassidy said, meaning it, My mother died when I was 8. Childbirth, the baby didn't survive either. Thomas was quiet for a moment. And your father died when I was 14. Cassidy looked away, the memory still painful. Pneumonia, I tried everything I knew, but I was still learning then. That's young to be left alone, she shrugged. I managed. My mother's sister checked on me for a while, but she has her own family in Denver. I've been on my own since I was 16. Thomas was watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Not the usual stare of suspicion or disgust she received in town, but something more evaluative. What? She finally asked. Just thinking it takes considerable strength to survive alone for so long, Cassidy didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments were foreign currency to her. I should continue gathering, she said instead. Daylight's wasting. Thomas nodded, then hesitated. Miss Reynolds, I wonder if I might ask a favor. She raised an eyebrow, suspicious. What kind of favor? I've got a troublesome rash on my arm, been there nearly a week now, itches something fierce. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal angry red skin. Doc Sanders gave me a salve that did nothing but make my wallet lighter. Cassidy moved closer, examining the inflamed area with professional detachment. How did this happen? Cleared some brush behind the jailhouse. Think I may have tangled with something I shouldn't have. Poison ivy, she confirmed, and it's spreading because you've been scratching it. He had the grace to look chagrined. Guilty. Cassidy sighed, then placed her basket on the ground. Wait here. She disappeared into the underbrush, returning minutes later with several plants. I'll make you a poultice. It won't cure it overnight, but it will ease the itching and help it heal faster. She worked quickly, crushing leaves between flat river stones and adding a little water to make a paste. The familiar process calmed her, the knowledge flowing through her fingers like the river beside them. When she'd finished, she applied the green mixture to Thomas's arm, her touch clinical and precise. Keep this on for at least an hour, she instructed. Then wash it off gently. I'll give you enough to apply again tonight. Thank you. His voice had softened. He watched as she wrapped a large leaf around his arm to hold the poultice in place. They're fools to drive you away. Cassidy's hands stilled momentarily before finishing her work. Perhaps. But they've made their decision. Decisions can be changed. She looked up at him, trying to read his expression. Not this one. Thomas caught her gaze, held it. You know what I find interesting, Miss Reynolds? You were cast out for being different, but from where I'm standing, that difference makes you exactly what this town needs. The town disagrees. The town hasn't thought it through. He flexed his arm experimentally. The itching's already better. Give it time, she said, gathering her supplies. That's precisely what I intend to do. Thomas rolled down his sleeve carefully. Give it time. Before Cassidy could ask what he meant, he had mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her once more. I'll see you in town, Miss Reynolds. She watched him ride away, perplexed by the encounter. It wasn't until she'd returned to her gathering that she realized he'd left a small leather pouch beside her basket. Inside were $3 silver, far more than the poultice was worth. Cassidy returned to her cabin as the sun climbed high, her basket full of herbs and her mind full of questions. The silver dollars weighed heavy in her pocket. Payment or charity, either way it would help with whatever came next. She spent the afternoon sorting and drying herbs, trying not to look at the growing pile of possessions she'd packed for her exile. Her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's medicine pouch, the few books she owned. What couldn't fit in her saddlebags would have to stay behind. The knock at her door came as evening shadows lengthened across her floor. Cassidy froze, knife in hand where she'd been cutting dried herbs. No one visited her here, not willingly, not kindly. Miss Reynolds, Thomas Quinn's voice called from outside. It's Deputy Quinn. Relief and suspicion warred within her as she placed the knife down and moved to open the door. Thomas stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking oddly formal. Deputy, she greeted cautiously. Is something wrong? No, madam. I wanted to thank you properly for your help this morning. The poultice worked better than anything Doc Sanders has ever given me. You already paid me, Cassidy reminded him, quite generously. That was payment for services. He shifted, suddenly looking less sure of himself. This is different. I was hoping you might allow me to take you to dinner. Cassidy stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Dinner? Yes, madam, at the hotel restaurant. When she continued to stare, he added, they serve a fine steak on Tuesdays. Deputy Quinn, Cassidy said slowly, have you forgotten that this town has voted to cast me out? No establishment will serve me. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Let me worry about that. Why? The question burst from her before she could stop it. Why would you do this? He considered her for a long moment. Because you helped me when you didn't have to. Because I think this town is making a mistake, and because I'd like to get to know the woman brave enough to stand alone against an entire community. Cassidy felt heat rise to her cheeks. I have nothing suitable to wear to a restaurant. What you're wearing is just fine, he assured her, glancing at her simple blue dress. Will you come? Every instinct told her to refuse, to protect herself from further humiliation, but something in his steady gaze made her nod. Very well, deputy, but don't say I didn't warn you. The walk to town was tense, with Cassidy acutely aware of every stare, every whispered comment. Thomas seemed oblivious, chatting easily about his horse, the weather, anything but the hostility surrounding them. As they approached the Grand Hotel, Cassidy faltered. This isn't going to work, she murmured. Thomas placed a gentle hand at the small of her back. Trust me, he said quietly, and before she could respond, he was guiding her up the steps and into the hotel lobby. The maitre d' looked up, his welcoming smile freezing when he saw Cassidy. Deputy Quinn, he said stiffly, I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening. Thomas glanced pointedly around the half-empty restaurant. Is that so, Mr. Peterson? Because it seems to me you have plenty of tables available. Perhaps I misspoke, Peterson amended. We are accepting no new diners at this time. I see. Thomas's voice remained pleasant, but something in his tone made the maitre d' shift uncomfortably. And would your reluctance have anything to do with my dining companion? Peterson's gaze slid to Cassidy, then away. The establishment reserves the right to refuse service to anyone, yes. I'm familiar with the policy, Thomas interrupted. I'm also familiar with the law regarding businesses that operate with a public license. Would you like me to discuss those laws with Sheriff Davis? I'm sure he'd be interested to hear why a tax-paying resident is being denied service. The maitre d' paled slightly. That won't be necessary, deputy. Please follow me. He led them to a table in the far corner, as removed from other diners as possible. Thomas thanked him as if they'd been given the best table in the house, pulling out Cassidy's chair with a flourish that drew even more stares. You shouldn't have done that, Cassidy whispered once they were seated. You're making enemies. Any man who'd deny a lady dinner because of her heritage isn't a man whose friendship I value, Thomas replied, unfolding his napkin. Now, I recommend the steak. As I said, it's quite good on Tuesdays. Despite herself, Cassidy felt a smile tugging at her lips. You're either very brave or very foolish, Deputy Quinn. He looked up, his gray eyes warm. I prefer to think of it as principled, and please call me Thomas. We're not officially in a deputy citizen capacity at the moment. Thomas, then, she conceded. Though I doubt our waiter will appear any time soon. As if to prove her wrong, a waiter approached, his expression carefully neutral. What can I get for you this evening? Thomas ordered steaks for them both, along with potatoes and green beans, then added a bottle of wine that made the waiter's eyebrows rise. Celebrating something, sir? He asked. New beginnings, Thomas replied with a smile, and the simple phrase sent an inexplicable warmth through Cassidy's chest. When the waiter departed, Cassidy leaned forward. You still haven't told me why you're really doing this. Thomas considered her question. Do you know why I became a lawman, Cassidy? The use of her given name startled her. No, my father was a Missouri state judge, believed in the law like some men believe in God, raised me to think the same. He traced a pattern on the tablecloth. When I was 18, I watched him sentence a man to hang for stealing a horse. The man had a wife, 3 children, took the horse to get a doctor for his sick son. Cassidy's breath caught. What happened? They hanged him. His son died anyway. His widow came to our house afterward, not to seek revenge, but to return my mother's shawl. She'd been doing laundry for us to make extra money. Thomas's eyes darkened with the memory. My father shut the door in her face, said the law was the law, That's terrible, Cassidy whispered. I left home the next day, decided if I was going to uphold the law, I'd do it with mercy. He looked up at her. So when I see a town turning against one of its own because they fear what they don't understand, it matters to me. When I see someone using their gifts to help others despite being hated for it, that matters too. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Before Cassidy could respond, their wine arrived, followed shortly by their meal. The steak was indeed excellent, and Cassidy realized how long it had been since she'd eaten anything but her own simple cooking. As they ate, Thomas asked questions about her healing, genuinely interested in her knowledge. Cassidy found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, explaining the properties of different herbs, how she diagnosed ailments, which remedies worked best for various conditions. My father believed everything we need to heal our bodies grows from the earth, she explained. He taught me to listen to plants to understand their purpose. Listen to them. Thomas looked intrigued rather than skeptical. How does one do that? Not with your ears, Cassidy smiled, with your hands, your eyes. The way a plant grows, where it thrives, its color, scent, all of these tell you what it can do. Plants that grow in wet places often reduce fevers. Yellow flowers frequently help liver ailments. Remarkable, Thomas murmured. And your mother, was she accepting of your father's ways? A shadow crossed Cassidy's face. My mother loved my father completely. They met when he saved her from drowning in the Arkansas River. She defied her family to marry him. She twisted her napkin. When she died, her parents refused to help, said she'd made her choice. So you've been judged your entire life for things beyond your control. Haven't we all in one way or another? Cassidy took a sip of wine. Your turn, Deputy. What brought you to La Junta? Thomas leaned back. Sheriff Davis is an old friend of my former captain. When his previous deputy retired, he sent word asking for recommendations. I was ready for something quieter than Denver. And you chose La Junta? Cassidy couldn't help but laugh. There are tumbleweeds with more exciting lives. Sometimes quiet is good, his eyes held hers. Though I'm finding it more interesting by the day. The warmth in his gaze made Cassidy look away. You won't win any popularity contests by being seen with me. I've never been much for contests. He signaled for the bill. Would you allow me to walk you home? The streets were dark and mostly empty as they made their way back to Cassidy's cabin. A nearly full moon silvered the landscape, turning the dusty road into a ribbon of light. They walked close but not touching, an awareness humming between them. Thank you, Cassidy said as they reached her porch. That's the first time I've eaten in that restaurant without someone asking me to leave. Their loss, Thomas replied. And my pleasure. He hesitated, then added, I meant what I said earlier. I think this town is making a mistake. Cassidy sighed. It doesn't matter what you think, Thomas. The decision's been made. Decisions can be unmade. Not this one. She shook her head. I've never belonged here, not fully. Perhaps it's time I found somewhere I do. Thomas studied her in the moonlight. What if you already have? Before she could ask what he meant, he'd taken her hand and raised it to his lips in a gentle gesture that sent shivers up her arm. Good night, Cassidy Reynolds. She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from his touch, her mind racing with possibilities she'd long ago learned not to consider. The next morning brought no respite from her impending exile. Cassidy spent it packing the last of her belongings, sorting through memories, deciding what must stay behind. Her cabin, left to her by her parents, would likely be claimed by the town once she was gone. The thought of strangers walking these floors, touching these walls, made her chest ache with a fury she could barely contain. By midday, the heat had become oppressive inside the small cabin. Cassidy stepped onto her porch for air, only to freeze at the sight that greeted her. Sheriff Davis and Mr. Thatcher from the general store stood beside a wagon in her yard. 3 other men from the town council flanked them. Miss Reynolds, the sheriff called, we need to have a word. Cassidy's hand instinctively went to the knife at her belt. I still have 3 days, Sheriff. Plans have changed. Thatcher's voice dripped with satisfaction. We've decided it's best if you leave today. By whose authority? Cassidy demanded. Town council met this morning, Sheriff Davis said, at least having the decency to look uncomfortable. It was decided unanimously. I see, Cassidy fought to keep her voice steady. And what prompted this change? Thatcher spat on the ground. Don't play innocent, parading around town with the deputy, eating at the Grand like you belong there, getting ideas above your station. So that was it. Her dinner with Thomas had accelerated their timeline. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but Cassidy forced it down, channeling it into anger instead. I'm entitled to finish packing my belongings. You've got 1 hour, the sheriff said. Then you'll be escorted to the county line. And my cabin, property of La Junta now, Thatcher replied. Payment for all the trouble you've caused. Cassidy's fists clenched at her sides. That's theft. It's the law, Sheriff Davis corrected. Abandoned property reverts to the town. It's not abandoned if I'm forced to leave it. 1 hour, Miss Reynolds, the sheriff repeated. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The men retreated to their wagon but didn't leave. They would wait, Cassidy knew, to ensure she complied. With no choice, she returned inside and began frantically gathering what she could. Her mare could carry her and 2 saddlebags, nothing more. Every item she selected meant leaving another behind. She was securing the last bag when a knock came at her back door. Heart racing, she opened it to find Thomas, his expression grim. I just heard, he said, stepping inside. I was in Carson Creek delivering a prisoner. Got back to find they'd moved up the timeline. It's because of last night, Cassidy said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. They didn't like seeing me treated as an equal. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. This isn't right, it's not legal. It doesn't matter what's right or legal. Cassidy tied the last of her herbs into bundles. They have the power and I don't. Let me talk to the sheriff. I can, you can't. She faced him squarely. This started long before you arrived, Thomas. It won't be solved in an hour. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Then come back. Once they've calmed down, once I've had time to work on them, no. The word was soft but final. I won't go where I'm not wanted. Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture so unexpected that Cassidy froze. You're wanted, Cassidy, by me. The words hung in the air between them, honest and exposed. For a moment, Cassidy allowed herself to lean into his touch, to imagine what it might be like to stay, to be defended, to belong. Then reality reasserted itself. You barely know me, she whispered. I know enough. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone. I know you're brave and kind. I know you heal people even when they hate you for it. I know you're the most interesting person I've met in this town, in any town. Cassidy stepped back, breaking the connection. I have to go, Thomas. They're waiting. Disappointment flashed across his face, quickly masked. At least let me help you pack your horse. Together they loaded her mare, securing the saddlebags and her bedroll. The men by the wagon watched with suspicion, Thatcher's face darkening at the sight of the deputy assisting her. Where will you go? Thomas asked as she mounted. North, I think. Toward Denver. My aunt is there. Cassidy adjusted her hat against the sun. Thank you for your kindness, Deputy Quinn. It meant more than you know. Thomas placed his hand on her horse's neck, looking up at her with those storm-gray eyes. This isn't over, Cassidy Reynolds. She offered him a sad smile. I believe it is. With a gentle nudge to her mare's sides, Cassidy rode toward the waiting men. Sheriff Davis nodded, satisfied, and led the procession out of town. Cassidy didn't look back, keeping her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her tears. The escort left her at the county line, Sheriff Davis offering a gruff good luck before turning back with his men. Cassidy continued north, following the road toward Denver, her thoughts a tumult of anger, grief, and a strange, unexpected regret centered around a pair of gray eyes that had truly seen her for the first time in years. She made camp that night beside a small creek, the sounds of nature providing little comfort to her wounded spirit. As she watched the stars emerge, Cassidy wondered if she'd made a mistake in leaving so easily. Should she have fought harder, but what good would it have done? One half Cheyenne woman against an entire town and Thomas. What could he really have offered her? A few kind words, a single dinner, a touch that still burned on her skin hours later. None of it was enough to build a life upon. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of her parents, of Thomas, of roads stretching endlessly before her. She woke before dawn, cold and stiff, to the sound of hoofbeats approaching her camp. Knife drawn, Cassidy emerged from her blankets to see a rider approaching through the pre-dawn mist. The silhouette was unmistakable: broad shoulders, straight back, the distinctive shape of a cowboy hat. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, deputy," she called as Thomas dismounted. "I'm not here as a deputy." He approached cautiously, hands visible at his sides. "I'm here as a man who couldn't let you ride away." Cassidy lowered her knife but didn't sheath it. "How did you find me?" "Tracked you." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Before I wore a badge, I guided hunting parties in Wyoming. Following a single rider on a well-traveled road isn't much of a challenge." "Why are you here, Thomas?" Her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "What more is there to say?" He took another step closer. "Everything. There's everything to say, Cassidy." The earnestness in his voice made her chest ache. "They cast me out. It's done." "It doesn't have to be." Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I spent all night talking to people, starting with Mrs. Wilkins, the woman whose life you saved, then her husband, who happens to be on the town council. Then others who have benefited from your healing but were too afraid to speak up." Cassidy stared at the paper he held out. "What is that?" "A petition, signed by 23 citizens of La Junta, requesting that the town council reconsider your banishment." Pride colored his voice. "Turns out plenty of folks have sought your help in secret over the years. They were just too cowardly to admit it publicly." Hope fluttered in Cassidy's chest, but she tamped it down. 23 signatures won't change Thatcher's mind or the sheriff's." "Maybe not immediately," Thomas conceded, "but it's a start, and in the meantime." He hesitated, uncertainty crossing his features for the first time. "I have a proposition for you." Cassidy waited, wary. "My property lies just outside the town limits," Thomas continued. 10 acres with a small house. I bought it when I took the deputy position, thinking I might try my hand at ranching someday." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you could stay there, practice your healing without the town's interference. Those who want your help could come to you, and the town council would have no jurisdiction over what happens on private property." Cassidy stared at him. "You'd risk your position, your reputation to help me?" "I told you before," Thomas said quietly. "I believe in doing what's right, not just what's legal, and driving you away isn't right." The sincerity in his eyes made Cassidy's resolve waver. "Why, Thomas? Why go to all this trouble for someone you barely know?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the day's growth of stubble on his jaw. "Because from the moment I saw you standing your ground against those drunks, I knew you were someone worth fighting for. Because when you tended my arm by the river, I saw a gentleness that belied your strength. Because when we talked over dinner, I felt like I'd finally found someone who understood what matters." Thomas took a deep breath. "And because when I imagine La Junta without you in it, it seems like a place I wouldn't want to be." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Cassidy searched his face for any sign of deceit, any hint that this was some elaborate trick, but found only open sincerity. "This is madness," she whispered. "We hardly know each other." "Then let's change that." Thomas held out his hand. "Come back with me, Cassidy, not to bow to their prejudice, but to stand against it, together." Cassidy looked at his outstretched hand, then at the road stretching northward. Denver was the sensible choice. Her aunt would welcome her eventually. She could start over, somewhere no one knew her history. But as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the landscape in gold, Cassidy realized she was tired of running from who she was. Tired of apologizing for the blood that ran in her veins, the knowledge her father had entrusted to her. She took Thomas's hand. "I won't hide who I am," she warned, "not even for you." His fingers tightened around hers. "I would never ask you to." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "In fact, I think your difference is exactly what makes you perfect." "Perfect?" Cassidy couldn't help but laugh. "I'm many things, Deputy Quinn, but perfect isn't one of them." Thomas's smile softened as he drew her closer. You were cast out for being different, he said, his voice low and certain. But to me, that difference makes you perfect. Your courage, your skill, your heritage, all of it. You're perfect to me, Cassidy Reynolds. The words wrapped around her heart like a healing balm. Before she could respond, Thomas had closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Cassidy melted into him, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they broke apart, Cassidy found herself smiling despite everything. You know this won't be easy, she cautioned. Few things worth doing are. Thomas tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, but I've never been one to take the easy path. Neither have I, Cassidy admitted. They packed her camp together as the day brightened, a new sense of possibility threading through Cassidy's movements. She didn't know what awaited them in La Junta, what obstacles they would face, but for the first time in years she wouldn't be facing them alone. As they mounted their horses, Thomas reached across to take her hand once more. Ready, Cassidy looked back at the road she'd traveled, then toward the direction of La Junta, toward a fight she'd never expected to rejoin, a future she'd never dared imagine. Ready. Together, they turned their horses south, riding side by side into the rising sun. The return to La Junta was nothing like Cassidy had expected. Instead of riding straight through town in defiance, Thomas led her on a circuitous route to his property, avoiding the curious eyes of townsfolk. His land lay to the southeast, a modest spread of rolling prairie with a small but solidly built cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods. It's not much, Thomas said as they dismounted in front of the porch, but it's private. No one will bother you here. Cassidy walked the perimeter of the cabin, noting the well-maintained roof, the small garden plot overgrown with weeds, the sturdy corral where Thomas's chestnut gelding now grazed alongside her mare. You've barely lived here, she observed. I've been staying in rooms above the jail, he admitted. Easier for a deputy to be in town. The implications hung unspoken between them. Thomas would continue to live in town, she would remain here, hidden away like a shameful secret. The thought soured the tentative hope that had been building during their ride. I see, Cassidy said, her voice cooling. So I'm to be your secret tenant, Thomas frowned, sensing her withdrawal. No, Cassidy, this is temporary just until we can change minds in town. And if minds don't change. She faced him squarely. I won't live as a ghost, Thomas. I won't pretend I don't exist to make others comfortable. That's not what I'm asking. He moved closer, frustration evident in his expression. I'm asking for time to help people see you as I do. And how do you see me exactly? The question emerged sharper than she'd intended, the accumulated hurts of years making her defensive. Thomas didn't flinch from her tone. I see a woman who refuses to be less than who she is, who uses her gifts despite the cost, who stands her ground even when standing alone. His voice softened. I see someone worth fighting for, worth waiting for, someone I want to know better every day for as long as she'll allow it. The sincerity in his words disarmed her. Cassidy looked away, unable to maintain her defenses against such open honesty. I'm not used to having allies, she admitted quietly. Then it's time you got used to it. Thomas offered a small smile. Starting with getting you settled, I'll help you unpack, then I need to return to town for my shift. They worked in companionable silence, bringing Cassidy's belongings into the cabin. The interior was sparsely furnished, but clean: a table with 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a comfortable-looking bed in the corner, shelves lining one wall. Better than she'd expected, certainly better than sleeping rough on the trail to Denver. I'll bring supplies this evening, Thomas said as he prepared to leave. Anything particular you need? Cassidy thought of her herbs left behind, her garden abandoned. Seeds if you can find them. And planting tools. Thomas nodded. I'll do my best. He hesitated at the door. Will you be all right here alone? The concern in his voice warmed something long cold inside her. I've been alone most of my life, Deputy Quinn. I think I can manage a few hours. Thomas, he corrected gently. When we're alone, I'm just Thomas. Thomas, she echoed, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. He stepped closer, his hand rising to brush her cheek as it had in her cabin before she left. This time, Cassidy didn't pull away. "I'll return before sundown," he promised, then leaned in to place a chaste kiss on her forehead before departing. Cassidy watched him ride toward town, conflicted emotions churning within her. Part of her thrilled at his touch, his words, the promise of his return. Another part, the part that had learned caution through years of disappointment, warned her not to trust too quickly, not to hope too deeply. But as she turned to survey the cabin that was now her temporary home, Cassidy allowed herself a small measure of hope. It wasn't the future she'd envisioned, but it was a beginning, a chance to stand her ground rather than flee, and perhaps, just perhaps, a chance at something she'd long ago stopped believing she deserved. True to his word, Thomas returned as the sun began its descent, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. Cassidy helped him unload flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, and beans enough to last her weeks. More touching were the smaller items: seed packets for herbs and vegetables, a sturdy trowel and garden fork, a new kettle to replace the one she'd left behind. "The general store was reluctant to sell to me," Thomas admitted as they arranged the supplies on the shelves. "Thatcher seemed to suspect these weren't for my personal use," Cassidy frowned. "You shouldn't make an enemy of him. He has influence in town, so do others." Thomas produced a folded piece of paper from his pocket. 7 more signatures on the petition today, including Doc Sanders. Surprise jolted through her. "The doctor, but he's been one of my strongest critics." Thomas's smile held a hint of satisfaction. "Seems the good doctor had a change of heart after Mrs. Wilkins reminded him publicly that your remedies succeeded where his failed." His pride took a hit, but his business was taking a bigger one as folks started questioning his competence. The thought of the doctor who had dismissed her father's medicine now supporting her return struck Cassidy as darkly amusing. Conversion through competition. Not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's a start. Thomas set down the last jar of preserves. 30 signatures now, that's nearly a third of the adult population. Cassidy wanted to believe it mattered, that numbers could shift the balance of years of prejudice. "What does Sheriff Davis think of your petition?" Thomas's expression grew more serious. "He's concerned about my involvement, says a deputy shouldn't take sides in town matters." "He's right," Cassidy said softly. "You're risking your position. Some things are worth the risk." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I've arranged to have Sunday off. I thought perhaps you might join me for a picnic by the river. I know a spot where we won't be disturbed." The invitation, so normal, so ordinary, struck Cassidy as almost absurdly hopeful given their circumstances. Yet she found herself nodding. "I'd like that." His smile was worth the risk of disappointment. "Good, I'll come for you mid-morning." He glanced out the window at the deepening dusk. "I should go. Sheriff expects me back for evening rounds." At the door, he paused. "Cassidy, he seemed to struggle for words." "What is it?" she prompted. Thomas stepped back to her, resolve firming his features. Without warning, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, not the gentle forehead kiss from earlier, but a proper kiss, warm and insistent. Cassidy's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself against the unexpected intensity. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I just wanted to do that again," he admitted, his voice rough. "To remind us both that this is real." Cassidy's heart hammered against her ribs. "It feels too fragile to be real. Then we'll have to make it stronger." He kissed her once more, briefly, before stepping away. "Lock the door behind me. I'll see you Sunday." Cassidy watched him ride away, her lips still tingling, her mind racing with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without fear dogging her dreams. Sunday dawned clear and warm, the kind of early summer day that hinted at the heat to come without yet delivering its full force. Cassidy had spent the intervening days making the cabin more her own, starting a small herb garden, organizing her healing supplies, arranging her few possessions to create a sense of permanence she wasn't sure she should trust. She'd seen no one but Thomas, who'd visited briefly each evening with news from town. The petition had grown to 35 signatures. Sheriff Davis had grudgingly agreed not to enforce her banishment while the matter was under consideration. Thatcher had been overheard threatening to organize a counter-petition. It was progress of a sort, but Cassidy remained cautious. People could sign a paper in private. Standing beside her in public was another matter entirely. She dressed with care for their picnic, choosing her blue calico dress, the one that matched her eyes, her mother had always said. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. The small silver earrings that had been her mother's completed the picture. Thomas arrived precisely when promised, looking different out of his deputy's attire. In a simple white shirt and tan trousers with no badge in sight, he appeared younger, more carefree. The sight of him made Cassidy's heart skip traitorously. "You look lovely," he said simply, his appreciative gaze confirming his sincerity. "As do you," Cassidy replied, pleased when a flush crept up his neck at her compliment. "Different without your badge. Today I'm not the deputy," he said, offering his arm. "Just a man taking a beautiful woman on a picnic." The spot Thomas had chosen lay a mile upstream from town, where the Arkansas River widened into a placid pool before continuing its journey eastward. Cottonwoods provided dappled shade, and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. He spread a blanket beneath the largest tree and unpacked a feast that put Cassidy's meager cooking to shame: fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and berry tarts. "Did you make all this?" she asked, impressed. Thomas laughed. "Hardly, Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house took pity on me when I explained my intentions. She has a romantic heart beneath that stern exterior." They ate leisurely, talking of small things: Thomas's childhood in Missouri, Cassidy's memories of her father teaching her to fish in this very river, books they had both read, dreams they had harbored. In the dappled sunlight, with no accusing eyes upon them, it was easy to forget the obstacles they faced. After they'd eaten, Thomas leaned back against the tree trunk, watching as Cassidy wove a chain of wildflowers. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," he requested. Cassidy considered the question. "I can't swim," she admitted. "Despite growing up beside this river, my father tried to teach me after he saved my mother from drowning, but I was too frightened. It became a family joke: the water saved one Reynolds woman and terrified the other." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I could teach you if you'd like, perhaps someday." She placed the flower chain on his head like a crown, laughing at his mock regal expression. "Your turn. Tell me something no one knows about Deputy Thomas Quinn." He removed the flower crown, twirling it in his fingers. "I write poetry." Cassidy's eyebrows rose. "Poetry, terrible poetry," he clarified with a self-deprecating smile. "But yes, started during the war, a way to make sense of things that didn't make sense." "You fought in the war." This was new information. Thomas nodded, his expression sobering. "Joined up in '63 when I was 18, served until the end, saw things no man should see." Cassidy heard the shadows in his voice. "Is that why you became a lawman, to make things right?" "Partly." He set the flower crown aside. "Partly to make my father proud, though that ship sailed long ago. Mostly because I'm good with a gun and bad at farming." He smiled to lighten the moment, but Cassidy sensed the deeper truth beneath his words. "Would you recite one?" she asked. "One of your poems." Thomas looked startled, then embarrassed. "They're not fit for public consumption." "We're hardly in public," Cassidy pointed out, gesturing to the empty riverbank. "And I'm curious what a deputy's poetry might sound like." He hesitated, then sighed in surrender. "One verse." "And you're not allowed to laugh." Cassidy crossed her heart solemnly. "I would never." Thomas cleared his throat, looking anywhere but at her as he recited. "The river runs east toward promises of dawn, while I stand west, watching shadows grow. Between us lies the truth of what is gone and what remains for those who stay to know." Silence followed his words. Cassidy studied his profile, seeing vulnerability he rarely displayed. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "Not terrible at all." He glanced at her, searching for signs of mockery. Finding none, he relaxed slightly. "It's from a longer piece, written after my mother died." "I'd like to hear the rest someday," Cassidy said. "Someday," he agreed, then abruptly changed the subject. "Would you show me some of your herbs, explain how you use them?" "I've always been curious about natural healing." Grateful for his willingness to share something so personal, Cassidy obliged. They spent the next hour wandering along the riverbank as she pointed out medicinal plants, explaining their properties, demonstrating how to identify them. Thomas proved an attentive student, asking intelligent questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. As the sun began its westward descent, they reluctantly packed the picnic basket. Neither was eager for the day to end, to return to the reality that awaited beyond their riverside sanctuary. "Thank you," Cassidy said as they walked back toward their horses. "This was perfect." Thomas took her hand, entwining their fingers. "First of many, I hope." The sincerity in his voice made Cassidy's heart ache with both hope and fear. "Thomas," she began hesitantly, "what are we doing?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "What do you mean, this?" She gestured between them. "You and me, these feelings, this borrowed time on borrowed land." "Where does it lead?" Thomas studied her, his gray eyes serious. "Where do you want it to lead, Cassidy?" The question was both simple and impossibly complex. "I want." She took a deep breath. "I want to believe in possibilities I've never allowed myself to imagine. But I'm afraid to hope for things that might never be mine." "Tell me," he urged gently. "Tell me the possibilities you've imagined." Cassidy looked away, gathering courage to voice dreams she'd buried so deeply she'd almost forgotten them. "I want to practice my healing openly, without fear. I want to walk through town without whispers following me. I want—" Her voice faltered. "What else do you want?" Thomas's hand tightened around hers, meeting his gaze. Cassidy took the greatest risk of all, complete honesty. "I want someone who sees all of me and stays anyway. Who doesn't ask me to be less than I am, who stands beside me when it would be easier to walk away." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "I see you, Cassidy Reynolds, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere." The words, spoken with such quiet certainty, broke something inside her, a wall she'd built against hope, against hurt. "How can you be so sure? You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "And I want to know more, every day for as many days as you'll give me." He kissed her then, beneath the golden light of the setting sun, and Cassidy let herself believe, just for that moment, that some dreams might be possible after all. The following weeks fell into a pattern that began to feel dangerously like normal life. Cassidy tended her growing garden, organized her healing supplies, and waited for Thomas's evening visits. He brought news from town, supplies she couldn't procure herself, and increasingly people seeking her help. It began with Mrs. Wilkins, who arrived with a painful rash that Doc Sanders couldn't alleviate. She left with a poultice of plantain and comfrey, and word of Cassidy's effective treatment spread. Soon others came, farmers with injured hands, mothers with colicky babies, old men with aching joints. They came furtively at first, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting condemnation. But they came. Thomas often served as intermediary, directing those in need to Cassidy's door. The petition had stalled at 40 signatures, still impressive, but not enough to sway the town council. Thatcher had indeed organized opposition, gathering almost as many names on a counter-petition demanding Cassidy's permanent banishment. "It's a stalemate," Thomas admitted one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. "Sheriff Davis says the council is deadlocked." Cassidy sipped her tea, unsurprised. "So I remain in limbo, neither accepted nor rejected. For now." Thomas took her free hand. "But things are changing, Cassidy. People are beginning to see your value." "They see my usefulness," she corrected. "It's not the same as acceptance." He couldn't argue with that. They both knew most who sought her help still wouldn't acknowledge her in town, wouldn't invite her into their homes, wouldn't publicly support her return. Yet something was shifting, slowly but perceptibly. Thomas had begun spending more nights at his cabin than in town, his presence beside Cassidy no longer a secret. Sheriff Davis had grumbled but not objected, perhaps recognizing that his deputy performed his duties no less diligently for his personal attachments. And Cassidy herself was changing. The bitterness that had been her companion for so long was softening, replaced by a tentative hope that perhaps belonging was possible after all. Not belonging to the town necessarily, but to someone, to Thomas. They had not spoken of love, not directly. But it lived in the way Thomas sought her opinion on matters large and small. In the way, Cassidy found herself planning for a future rather than merely surviving the present. In the way, they gravitated toward each other when in the same room, as if pulled by forces neither could resist. It was a fragile piece, this life they were building. Cassidy knew it could shatter at any moment. But for now, it was enough to sit beside Thomas as night fell, their hands joined, their hearts beating in unison. The catalyst came, as such things often do, unexpectedly. It was late July, the heat of summer bearing down on La Junta with relentless intensity. Thomas had been called to Carson Creek again, this time to testify in court. He'd been gone 3 days, the longest they'd been separated since Cassidy's return. She was tending her garden in the cool of early morning when hoofbeats approached at a gallop. Rising quickly, Cassidy shaded her eyes to see a rider she recognized as Jeremy Collins, one of the younger ranch hands from the Walker spread. "Miss Reynolds," he called, reining in his lathered horse. "Come quick, it's Mr. Walker, he's been gored by a bull. Doc Sanders is away in Pueblo, and Mrs. Walker says there's no time to fetch him back." Cassidy hesitated only momentarily. Samuel Walker was one of the most influential men in the county and one who had signed Thatcher's counter-petition. But a life was at stake, and that trumped politics. "Let me gather my supplies," she said, hurrying inside. The Walker Ranch lay 5 miles north of town, a prosperous spread that employed a dozen men. Cassidy rode hard behind Jeremy, her saddlebags filled with herbs, bandages, and the surgical tools her father had taught her to use only in direst need. Mrs. Walker met them at the door, her face pale with worry. "He's in the bedroom," she said, leading Cassidy without preamble. "The men got the bull off him, but—" Her voice trailed off as she opened the bedroom door. Samuel Walker lay on the bed, his torso a mass of blood and torn flesh. His breathing came in ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. Cassidy assessed the damage with the clinical detachment her father had taught her: 3 deep puncture wounds, internal bleeding, a collapsed lung. "Everyone out," she ordered, rolling up her sleeves. "Except you," she added to Mrs. Walker. "I'll need your help." For the next 4 hours, Cassidy worked tirelessly. She cleaned the wounds, packed them with herbs to draw out infection, used a hollow reed to reinflate the collapsed lung, and stitched what could be stitched. Her father had learned such techniques from an army surgeon during the Mexican War, and he had passed the knowledge to his daughter despite knowing it would never be proper for a woman to perform such procedures. When she finally straightened, her back aching, her hands stained with blood, Cassidy met Mrs. Walker's anxious gaze. "I've done what I can. The next 24 hours will tell us if it's enough." "Will he live?" Mrs. Walker asked, her voice small. "If infection doesn't set in, if he's strong enough to recover from the blood loss." "Yes," Cassidy wiped her hands on a cloth, "but he needs constant care. Someone must stay with him, watch for fever, change the dressings." "I'll stay," Mrs. Walker said immediately. "And I'll return this evening to check on him." Cassidy began packing her supplies. "If his breathing changes or fever develops before then, send for me immediately." Mrs. Walker nodded, then hesitated. "Miss Reynolds, I know Samuel signed that petition against you." "I want you to know I didn't agree with it." Cassidy offered a tired smile. "That hardly matters now, Mrs. Walker. It matters to me." The older woman touched Cassidy's arm. "Thank you for coming, for helping him when you had every reason not to." "I help those who need helping," Cassidy said simply. "That's who I am." News of Samuel Walker's injury and Cassidy's intervention spread through La Junta like wildfire. By evening, when she returned to check on her patient, a small crowd had gathered outside the Walker Ranch. Some were merely curious, but others watched with open hostility as Cassidy dismounted and entered the house. Mr. Walker was conscious, weak but alert. The wounds showed no signs of infection, and his breathing had stabilized. He regarded Cassidy with a mixture of wariness and grudging respect as she changed his dressings. "My wife says you saved my life," he said finally, his voice raspy. "I helped," Cassidy corrected. "You did the hard work of staying alive." Walker snorted weakly. "Don't diminish what you did, girl." I know what a goring usually means. I've seen too many good men die from less. Cassidy said nothing, focusing on applying the poultice that would continue drawing out impurities. Why? Walker asked suddenly. Why help me when you knew I wanted you gone from this county? She met his gaze steadily. Because it was right, because I could, because my father taught me that healing isn't about who deserves it, but about who needs it. Walker was silent for a long moment. Your father, he said finally. He was the Cheyenne who married Elizabeth Thompson? Yes. Cassidy had not expected him to know her mother's name. I knew her before she met him. Walker's eyes took on a distant look. She had spirit, wouldn't bend to anyone's expectations. A ghost of a smile crossed his pale lips. You have the same look about you. So I've been told, Cassidy replied, finishing her work. You should rest now, I'll return tomorrow. As she left the bedroom, Mrs. Walker pressed a small pouch into her hand. For your trouble, she said. Cassidy tried to refuse, but the older woman insisted. Samuel pays his debts, she said firmly. Let him pay this one. Outside, the crowd had grown. As Cassidy emerged, a voice called out, Is it true? Walker's going to live. Before she could answer, another voice, one she recognized as belonging to Thatcher, shouted, Probably bewitched him. We all know what her kind can do. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some agreeing, others objecting. Cassidy kept her head high as she walked to her horse, determined not to show fear. My husband is alive because of Miss Reynolds's skill, Mrs. Walker's voice rang out from the porch. And I won't hear a word against her in my house or on my land. Any man who has a problem with that can find employment elsewhere. The declaration, coming from the wife of one of the most powerful men in the county, sent a shock wave through the gathering. Thatcher sputtered in disbelief, while others looked at Cassidy with new consideration in their eyes. As she mounted her mare, Cassidy caught sight of a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd. Thomas, dusty from the trail, his expression a mixture of concern and pride. Their eyes met briefly before Cassidy turned her horse toward home, aware that something fundamental had shifted in La Junta that day. Thomas found her later that evening, sitting on the porch steps, staring at the stars. He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Heard about Walker on my way back from Carson Creek, he said. Came straight here, but they told me you were at the ranch. He'll live, Cassidy said, barring complications. Thomas nodded. That's what Mrs. Walker told the crowd. Right before she threatened to fire anyone who spoke against you, a small smile curved Cassidy's lips. That was unexpected. Was it? Thomas turned to study her profile. You saved her husband's life, Cassidy. That tends to inspire gratitude in most people. Gratitude isn't the same as acceptance. She'd learned that lesson too many times to forget it now. Maybe not, Thomas conceded, but it's a start, and combined with the others you've helped these past weeks. He trailed off, then reached for her hand. Things are changing, Cassidy. Can you feel it? She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that one good deed could undo years of prejudice, but experience had taught her caution. Perhaps, was all she said. Thomas seemed to understand her reserve. I missed you, he said instead, changing the subject. 3 days felt like a month. The simple admission warmed her. I missed you too, Cassidy admitted softly. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. Enough to consider a more permanent arrangement. Cassidy turned to him, startled. What do you mean? In the silver light of the moon, Thomas's eyes were serious, his expression one she'd never seen before, nervous, hopeful, determined all at once. I mean, I don't want to leave again, not without knowing you'll be here when I return, not just as a healer using my land, but as. He took a deep breath. As my wife, the world seemed to still around them. Cassidy stared at him, certain she'd misheard. Your wife? Yes. Thomas took both her hands in his. I love you, Cassidy Reynolds. I think I've loved you since that first day by the river. I know it's fast, I know there are obstacles, but I don't care. I want to build a life with you, here or elsewhere if La Junta never accepts you fully. I want to wake beside you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to watch you heal people and grow your gardens and teach our children the ways of both their heritages. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small circle of silver. I'm not a wealthy man and this isn't fancy, but it was my mother's and she would have wanted you to have it. Cassidy looked at the simple ring, then at Thomas's earnest face. "The town will never accept a deputy married to a half Cheyenne healer," she whispered. "Then I'll turn in my badge," he said without hesitation. "We can go elsewhere, Denver, Santa Fe, wherever you want." "You would give up your position, your standing in the community, in a heartbeat." His voice was firm. "I became a deputy to uphold what's right. There's nothing right about denying love because of others' prejudice." Tears pricked Cassidy's eyes. "I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for me." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Thomas cupped her cheek. "You're more important to me than any badge, any town's approval. You're everything, Cassidy." The words, spoken with such certainty, broke through the last of her defenses. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Thomas. I'll marry you." His smile was brighter than the stars overhead as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he was kissing her, and Cassidy was kissing him back, and for one perfect moment, nothing else mattered, not the town's judgment, not the uncertain future, nothing but this man who loved her completely, differences and all. They were married 2 weeks later, not in the white clapboard church in town where Thomas had initially hoped, but beneath the cottonwoods by the Arkansas River. Sheriff Davis performed the ceremony, his official capacity as county magistrate allowing him to legally bind them despite the minister's refusal to officiate. The guest list was small but significant. Mrs. Walker came, supporting her still recovering husband who insisted on attending despite his wounds. Mrs. Wilkins and her family were there, as were several others whom Cassidy had helped in recent weeks. Even Doc Sanders attended, his professional curiosity having gradually transformed into reluctant respect for Cassidy's knowledge. Thatcher and his supporters made their displeasure known by organizing a town meeting scheduled for the same hour as the wedding. But their attendance would not have been welcomed anyway, and the couple preferred the smaller gathering of those who truly wished them well. Cassidy wore a new dress of pale blue, ordered specially from Denver with some of the money the Walkers had paid her. Her mother's silver earrings and her father's medicine pouch completed her ensemble, the perfect blending of her dual heritage. Thomas was resplendent in a new suit, his badge polished and pinned to his lapel. "You're keeping it, then?" Cassidy had asked when she saw the badge. "For now," Thomas had replied. "Sheriff Davis asked me to stay on, says the town needs a deputy who understands justice isn't always what's popular." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Thomas had written his own vows, his terrible poetry bringing tears to more eyes than just Cassidy's. She had prepared a Cheyenne blessing taught to her by her father, the words connecting her to his memory in a way that made her feel his presence strongly. When Sheriff Davis pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed his bride with a fervor that made the older ladies fan themselves and the men look away in embarrassment. Cassidy responded with equal enthusiasm, no longer concerned with propriety or judgment. "Mrs. Quinn," Thomas murmured against her lips. "Miss Reynolds Quinn," Cassidy corrected with a smile. "I'm keeping both names, remember? How could I forget?" He grinned. "The first of many compromises in our married life, I'm sure." The small celebration that followed was joyful despite, or perhaps because of its intimacy. Mrs. Walker had arranged for food from the hotel restaurant, overriding the owner's objections with the simple power of her husband's name and wealth. Wine flowed, toasts were made, and for a few hours Cassidy felt something she had rarely experienced in La Junta: belonging. As the sun began to set, the newlyweds said their goodbyes and rode back to the cabin that was now officially their home. Thomas had expanded it during the 2 weeks of their engagement, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main room to accommodate Cassidy's growing collection of healing supplies. "Welcome home, wife," Thomas said as he carried her across the threshold, his gray eyes warm with promise. "Home," Cassidy repeated, the word sweet on her tongue. "I like the sound of that." Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness of their new bedroom, Thomas traced lazy patterns on Cassidy's bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. "Very." She nestled closer, marveling at how right it felt to be here like this with him. Are you having regrets yet about marrying the town outcast? Thomas propped himself up on one elbow to look at her properly. The only thing I regret is not finding you sooner. He kissed her softly. And you're not an outcast anymore, you're my wife. Anyone who has a problem with that will answer to me. Cassidy smiled at his protectiveness. My gallant deputy. Always, he promised, gathering her close once more. As summer gave way to fall, life settled into a pattern both expected and surprising. Thomas continued his duties as deputy while Cassidy's healing practice grew steadily. After Samuel Walker's public endorsement, others became less hesitant to seek her help openly. Even Doc Sanders began referring certain cases to her, those involving children with fevers, women with female complaints, and ailments his traditional methods couldn't touch. The town's attitude remained divided. Some, like Thatcher, maintained their distance and disapproval. Others cautiously accepted Cassidy's presence, if not her heritage. A few, particularly those she had healed, defended her vigorously. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress more than Cassidy had dared hope for when she'd been banished months earlier. Their home became a sanctuary not just for them, but for those seeking healing of body and spirit. Thomas built shelves for Cassidy's expanding collection of herbs and remedies. She created a garden that bloomed with both medicinal and culinary plants. Together, they made the cabin into a place where all were welcome, regardless of background. In December, as the first snow dusted La Junta, Cassidy made a discovery that changed everything once again. She'd been feeling unusually tired, her stomach unsettled each morning. The signs were unmistakable to someone with her training, but she confirmed with the appropriate herbs before sharing the news with Thomas. He returned from his patrol that evening to find Cassidy waiting on the porch despite the cold, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. What is it? He asked, dismounting quickly. You'll catch your death out here. I have news, Cassidy said, her eyes bright with secret joy, news that couldn't wait. Thomas studied her face, concern giving way to curiosity. Good news, I hope. In answer, Cassidy took his hand and placed it against her still flat stomach. The best news. We're going to have a baby, Thomas, in summer. His expression transformed from confusion to wonder in the span of a heartbeat. A baby, you're certain? As certain as I can be, she confirmed. I've checked the signs. All indicate new life. Thomas let out a whoop of joy that startled his horse, then swept Cassidy into his arms, spinning her in circles until they were both dizzy with laughter and love. A baby, he repeated, setting her down gently. Our baby. Our baby, Cassidy agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Part of both of us. Thomas placed his hand over hers, both resting protectively over the tiny life they'd created. He or she will be perfect, he said with absolute conviction, just like their mother. Cassidy smiled, remembering the words he'd spoken to her all those months ago by the riverbank. Different, she corrected softly, and all the stronger for it. Different, Thomas agreed, kissing her in the falling snow, and perfect to us. The baby arrived in late June of 1879, following a labor that left even Cassidy, with all her healing knowledge, exhausted and humbled. Thomas had refused to leave her side despite the conventions of the time, holding her hand through each contraction, whispering encouragement when her strength faltered. When their son finally made his entrance into the world, squalling with healthy indignation, both parents were overcome with emotion. The midwife, an elderly woman from a neighboring ranch whom Cassidy had once treated for rheumatism, cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing him in his mother's arms. He's beautiful, Thomas whispered, one finger gently tracing the perfect curve of his son's cheek. Look what we made, Cassidy. The baby had Thomas's cleft chin and Cassidy's high cheekbones, a perfect blend of their features. His skin tone was a shade darker than his father's, a little lighter than his mother's, another beautiful compromise between their heritages. What shall we name him? Cassidy asked, though they had discussed possibilities for months. Thomas smiled. I still like the name we chose if it was a boy. William, Cassidy nodded, after your father. She had suggested it, knowing how important it was to Thomas to honor the complicated relationship with his judge father, despite their differences. William Charles Quinn, Thomas specified, adding her father's name as they had agreed, a name to be proud of. A name from both sides of his family, Cassidy added softly, so he never forgets where he comes from. News of William's birth spread quickly through La Junta. To the couple's surprise, visitors began arriving the very next day, women from town bringing food and baby clothes, ranchers' wives offering practical advice, even children eager to see the new arrival. Among them was Mrs. Walker, bearing a handmade quilt of exceptional quality. "Every child should have something beautiful to call their own," she said, placing the gift beside Cassidy's bed, "especially a child who represents such hope for our town." Cassidy looked up from nursing her son. "Hope," Mrs. Walker smiled. "Yes, my dear. Hope that the old ways of thinking are finally changing. That the next generation might judge people by their actions rather than their bloodlines." It was a sentiment echoed by Sheriff Davis when he visited a few days later, gruffly admiring his deputy's son while pretending not to be affected by the tiny hand that wrapped around his finger. "Fine boy you've got there," he said to Thomas. "Town's talking about organizing a proper christening at the church." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The same church that refused to marry us," the sheriff shrugged. "Ministers had a change of heart, or perhaps just recognizes which way the wind is blowing. Either way, the offer stands." Cassidy and Thomas discussed it that night. After William had been fed and settled in the cradle Thomas had carved during the long winter evenings of waiting. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, his arm around Cassidy as they watched their son sleep. "A christening in town would be a public acknowledgement of acceptance." "Partial acceptance," Cassidy corrected. "They're willing to accept our son because he's also your son, the deputy's child. It doesn't mean they've accepted me fully," Thomas sighed. "Perhaps not, but it's progress." Cassidy considered this. "I had thought to perform a Cheyenne naming ceremony as my father did for me, a way to honor that part of William's heritage." "Then that's what we'll do," Thomas said immediately. "The church can wait," but Cassidy shook her head, a new resolve forming. "No. We'll do both. The Cheyenne ceremony here privately, with those who truly accept all of who we are, and the christening in town publicly to show that William belongs to both worlds and need not choose between them." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Have I told you lately how much I admire your wisdom, Mrs. Reynolds Quinn?" "Not since breakfast," Cassidy teased. "I was beginning to worry." He laughed softly, careful not to wake the baby. "I admire your wisdom, your strength, your beauty, and your extraordinary ability to heal not just bodies but a town's prejudices." "The town has a long way to go," Cassidy cautioned. "As do we all," Thomas agreed, "but we've made a start, and we have a lifetime to continue the work." The Cheyenne naming ceremony took place when William was 2 weeks old, attended by a small group of friends who had proven their loyalty and acceptance. Thomas had sent for a Cheyenne elder from a nearby reservation, a man who had known Cassidy's father, and agreed to travel to La Junta for this special occasion. The ceremony was simple but profound, connecting William to his heritage, to the earth, to the traditions that had shaped his mother's understanding of the world. The elder blessed the child with sage smoke and water from the Arkansas River, speaking words in the Cheyenne language that Cassidy translated for Thomas and their guests. William was given a second name, one that would be used only in ceremonies and sacred contexts, Bright Path, for the way his birth had illuminated new possibilities for understanding between peoples. The following Sunday, William Charles Quinn was christened in the white clapboard church in La Junta, the same church that had refused to marry his parents less than a year earlier. The building was filled to capacity, with curious townsfolk crowding the pews to witness this symbol of changing times. Cassidy wore her best dress and held her head high as she walked down the aisle beside Thomas, their son cradled in her arms. She felt the stares, heard the whispers, but focused on the weight of William against her chest, the solid presence of Thomas beside her, the knowledge that they were making history in their small way. The minister performed the ceremony with proper dignity, though Cassidy noted the slight hesitation in his voice when he named the child's mother. William, for his part, behaved perfectly, his solemn dark eyes taking in the proceedings with what Thomas insisted was precocious intelligence. Afterward, there was a small reception in the church hall. Not everyone stayed. Thatcher and his closest allies made a point of departing immediately after the service, but enough remained to make the gathering feel like a genuine celebration rather than a grudging acknowledgement. "Well, well," a voice said as Cassidy stood by the refreshment table, William sleeping against her shoulder. "The prodigal returns in triumph." She turned to see Doc Sanders, a cup of punch in his hand, his expression inscrutable. "Hardly in triumph, Doctor," she replied calmly. "Simply as a mother having her son christened." The doctor studied William's sleeping face. "Strong boy, takes after both his parents, I'd say. Thank you." Cassidy wasn't sure if it was a compliment or merely an observation. Sanders cleared his throat awkwardly. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Miss Reynolds, Mrs. Quinn, whatever you prefer to be called." "Either is fine," Cassidy said, curious now. "I've observed your methods these past months," the doctor continued. "Your results with certain conditions are impressive." Coming from Sanders, it was high praise indeed. "Thank you," Cassidy said again. "I wonder if you might consider a more formal arrangement." The doctor set down his punch, his manner becoming more businesslike. "A partnership of sorts. There are aspects of medicine they don't teach at medical school: herbal remedies, poultices, treatments passed down through generations." Cassidy stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You want to partner with me? Consult," Sanders amended quickly. "Share knowledge. For the benefit of our patients." It was more than Cassidy had ever expected from the man who had once dismissed her father's medicine as primitive superstition. "I would be open to such an arrangement," she said carefully, "for the benefit of those we serve." Sanders nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good, good, we can discuss details later." He glanced around the church hall. "Quite a turnout today, your husband must be pleased." Cassidy followed his gaze to where Thomas stood across the room, deep in conversation with Sheriff Davis and Mr. Walker. "We both are. It's important that William grow up feeling he belongs here." "And you?" Sanders asked unexpectedly. "Do you feel you belong here now, Mrs. Quinn?" The question gave Cassidy pause. Did she belong? In this town that had cast her out, then grudgingly allowed her return. Among people who still regarded her with suspicion as often as acceptance. "I belong with my family," she said finally. "With Thomas and William, the rest is." She shrugged. "The rest is a work in progress." Sanders seemed to consider this. "Fair enough," he said, then added, "For what it's worth, this town would be poorer without your skills. I may not have always appreciated them, but I do now." It wasn't quite an apology for years of dismissal and prejudice, but it was something. Cassidy inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Doctor. That means a great deal coming from you." As Sanders moved away, Thomas appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. "Everything all right?" he asked, nodding toward the retreating doctor. "Better than all right," Cassidy replied, shifting William to a more comfortable position. "He's proposing a professional partnership, or consultation at least." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Sanders, the same man who once called your remedies primitive hokum?" "The very same." Cassidy couldn't help but smile at his astonishment. "People change, Thomas, sometimes for the better. So it seems." He glanced around the church hall at the mix of familiar faces, some friendly, some merely curious, a few still wary but present nonetheless. "A year ago, would you have imagined this, standing here with our son surrounded by people who came to celebrate his arrival?" "Never," Cassidy admitted. "A year ago, I was being escorted from the only home I'd ever known, certain I'd never return." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "And now?" "Now?" Cassidy looked down at their sleeping son, then up at her husband's face, lined with love and pride. "Now I'm standing in a place I never thought would accept me, beside a man I never thought I'd find, holding a child who represents everything I never dared hope for. And—" Thomas prompted, sensing there was more. Cassidy smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her face with a radiance that drew glances from across the room. "And I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As if in agreement, William stirred against her shoulder, making the small, contented sounds that never failed to melt his parents' hearts. Cassidy adjusted his blanket, marveling as she always did at his perfect fingers, the sweep of dark lashes against his cheeks, the miracle of his existence. "He's going to have a different life than either of us," Thomas said softly. "Better, I hope. Different," Cassidy agreed. "Not easier, necessarily. He'll face his own challenges, carry his own burdens, but he'll never doubt that he's loved. Never question his worth because of who his parents are or where his blood comes from." "No," Thomas said firmly. "He'll know from the start what I wish you'd always known, that being different isn't a flaw to overcome. It's a strength to celebrate." Cassidy leaned into him, their son cradled between them, a family forged from unlikely beginnings but bound by love stronger than any prejudice. "Perfect as we are," she murmured. "Perfect as we are," Thomas echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss that drew scandalized whispers and approving smiles in equal measure, neither of which mattered to the couple at the center of it all, who had found in each other everything the world had tried to deny them. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising. William grew from a solemn infant into an energetic boy with his father's curiosity and his mother's quiet determination. He roamed the expanded gardens around their cabin, learning the names and properties of plants alongside his alphabet and numbers. In town, he was a familiar sight, the deputy's son, greeted with smiles and occasional treats from shopkeepers who had once shunned his mother. Cassidy's partnership with Doc Sanders evolved from cautious consultation to genuine collaboration. They maintained separate practices but referred patients to each other based on their respective strengths. The arrangement benefited not only the healers but the town itself, which now boasted medical care that combined the best of traditional and herbal approaches. Thomas continued as deputy, though his duties had expanded to include training a younger man who would eventually take his place. The years of peace had allowed him to consider other pursuits, particularly the small horse breeding operation he'd started on their land, specializing in sturdy, intelligent mounts suitable for ranch work. Their family had grown as well. 2 years after William's birth, Cassidy had given birth to twin girls Elizabeth and Catherine, named for the grandmothers they would never meet. At 3, the twins were as different as sisters could be: Elizabeth quiet and thoughtful like her mother, Catherine bold and adventurous like her father. Yet both shared the same striking features. Their mother's high cheekbones and dark hair, their father's gray eyes. La Junta had changed too. The town had grown with the expanding railroad, bringing new residents who had no history with the Quinns, no preconceived notions about what was proper or acceptable. Thatcher had retired, his general store now run by his more progressive nephew. Even the church had a new minister, a younger man who had served diverse congregations in Kansas and brought with him more inclusive views. Not everything was perfect, of course. There were still those who crossed the street when they saw Cassidy coming, who whispered behind their hands when the Quinn children passed. But such instances were rarer now, overshadowed by the genuine acceptance the family had earned through years of quiet perseverance. On a warm June evening in 1884, the Quinns hosted a gathering to celebrate William's 5th birthday. Their expanded cabin and surrounding gardens accommodated the guests comfortably, a mix of townspeople and ranching families, adults and children, all united in their affection for the birthday boy. Cassidy watched from the porch as William led a group of children in a game of tag, his dark hair flying, his laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Nearby, Thomas supervised a smaller group of toddlers, including the twins, who were attempting to catch fireflies in glass jars. "He's growing so fast," Mrs. Walker commented, joining Cassidy on the porch. Now in her 60s, the older woman had become something of a surrogate grandmother to the Quinn children. "Bright as his father and stubborn as his mother," Cassidy laughed. "An accurate assessment, I'm afraid, Mrs." Walker sipped her lemonade thoughtfully. "I remember when Samuel and I first came to La Junta, nearly 30 years ago now. This town was nothing but a few buildings and a lot of dust. It's changed quite a bit, Cassidy agreed, thanks in part to you and Thomas, Mrs. Walker placed a hand on Cassidy's arm. You've shown people a different way to be, taught them that healing comes in many forms. Cassidy smiled, touched by the older woman's words. We've just lived our lives the best way we know how, and that's exactly what's made the difference, Mrs. Walker nodded toward where Doc Sanders was demonstrating a magnifying glass to a fascinated William. Would you have imagined that 5 years ago, the town doctor playing scientific mentor to your son? No, Cassidy admitted, but then I wouldn't have imagined any of this. As the evening progressed, guests departed in twos and threes, offering final birthday wishes to William and thanks to his parents for their hospitality. Eventually, only family remained Thomas, Cassidy, their 3 children, and Sheriff Davis, who had become an honorary uncle to the Quinn offspring. Another successful celebration, Thomas said, collapsing onto the porch steps beside Cassidy. The children were inside with Sheriff Davis, who was regaling them with a highly edited version of his adventures as a young lawman. Indeed, Cassidy leaned against her husband's shoulder. Though I think the twins may never sleep again after all that cake. Thomas laughed, his arm sliding around her waist in the familiar gesture that still, after all these years, sent warmth through her entire being. They'll crash eventually, they always do. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about something, Cassidy, something important. She turned to look at him. That sounds serious. It is, in a way. He took her hand, a gesture reminiscent of the day he'd proposed. Sheriff Davis is retiring at the end of the year. This wasn't news to Cassidy. Yes, he's mentioned it several times, practically counting the days until he can fish full-time. He's recommended me as his replacement. Cassidy stilled. Sheriff, you'd be sheriff of La Junta, Thomas nodded. The town council will vote, of course, but Davis seems confident they'll approve his recommendation. Cassidy searched for the right words. That's a great honor, Thomas. You deserve it. Maybe. He looked uncertain, an expression she rarely saw on his face. But I wanted to be sure you're comfortable with it. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility for our family. Cassidy understood his concern. As deputy, Thomas had been able to maintain some separation between his professional and personal life. As sheriff, the lines would blur. Their family would be even more in the public eye, subject to greater scrutiny. Does it worry you? She asked. How people might react to a sheriff married to a half Cheyenne healer? Thomas's answer was immediate and firm. No. Anyone who still has a problem with who you are isn't worth concerning myself with. Then why the hesitation? He sighed, running a hand through hair now threaded with strands of silver at the temples. Because being sheriff would mean being more deeply invested in a town that once rejected you. I don't want to remind you of that pain. Cassidy's heart swelled with love for this man who still, after all these years, put her feelings first. Thomas, she said gently, that was a different town, a different time. Look at our life now. Our children play with the children of people who once crossed the street to avoid me. I consult with the town doctor. The minister invites us to Sunday dinner. But some still whisper, Thomas pointed out. Some always will, Cassidy acknowledged. But they're fewer now, and their whispers matter less. She placed her hand on his cheek, turning his face to hers. You should accept the position. You'd be a wonderful sheriff, fair, principled, compassionate. This town needs that. Thomas studied her face. You're sure, truly sure? Absolutely. Cassidy smiled. Besides, it would be fitting, wouldn't it? The man who once escorted me from town limits becoming its highest lawman, a symbol of how far we've all come. Thomas laughed at that, the tension leaving his shoulders. When you put it that way, it does have a certain poetic justice. See, your terrible poetry is rubbing off on me after all these years. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Not so terrible if it won you, Mrs. Reynolds Quinn. Inside the cabin, they could hear their children's laughter, the low rumble of Sheriff Davis's voice spinning tales of the Old West. Outside, the land stretched peaceful and familiar around them. The garden Cassidy had expanded year by year, the corral where Thomas's horses grazed. The the river flowing steadily beyond their property, just as it had when they'd first met beside its banks. "We've built something good here," Cassidy said softly. "Something that matters." "We have," Thomas agreed. "Though sometimes I still can't believe how it all began with me seeing a brave woman standing her ground against 3 drunken fools." Cassidy laughed. "Not the most romantic beginning." "I disagree." Thomas's voice grew serious. "I saw your courage that day, your dignity in the face of cruelty. I admired you before I even knew your name. And I thought you were an interfering lawman who would forget me the moment I was out of sight," Cassidy teased. "How wrong you were." Thomas pulled her closer. "I couldn't have forgotten you if I'd tried." They fell silent again, content in each other's presence, in the life they'd built from unlikely beginnings. After a while, Thomas spoke again. "Do you ever regret it? Staying in La Junta when you could have gone anywhere, started fresh where no one knew your past?" Cassidy considered the question seriously, as she did all questions from the man who had changed her life. "No," she said finally. "Leaving would have been easier in some ways. But then I would have missed this, our home, our children, the chance to change minds rather than just escape them." She turned to face him fully. "And I would have missed you, Thomas Quinn, the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. Who said I was perfect when the world told me I was flawed." Thomas's eyes, still the same stormy gray that had first captured her attention, grew soft with emotion. "You were perfect then, and you're perfect now, different and extraordinary and exactly who you were meant to be." "As are you," Cassidy murmured, leaning in to kiss him beneath the star-filled sky that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers to family. Inside, their children called for them, eager for one more story before bed. Thomas stood first, offering Cassidy his hand in the gesture that had become symbolic of their relationship, a hand extended in support, in partnership, in love. As they walked toward the warm light spilling from their cabin windows, Cassidy reflected on the strange and beautiful path that had led her to this moment. Once cast out for being different, she had found a man who valued that difference, a family who embodied it, and eventually, a community that was learning to embrace it. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was the life she had built with courage, with persistence, and with the love of a man who had seen perfection where others saw only difference. A life worth every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt. A life that proved belonging wasn't about fitting in, but about standing firm until the world made space for who you truly were.